Hello, this is Sarah Tsui from Global Green News. I am joined today by the amazing Chlöe Swarbrick, Member of Parliament for the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand. In 2017, Ms. Swarbrick was the youngest MP in New Zealand Parliament at the age of 23. Following the election that took place last month on October 17th, this past Friday, Ms. Swarbrick was again officially confirmed as the MP for Auckland Central, narrowly beating the Labour candidate by 492 votes. Ms. Swarbrick, it is such a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for your time.
Kia ora, no worries at all. I just correct the record on one thing. When the special votes came through as of this past Friday, I had doubled that margin. So I now am confirmed as the Auckland Central MP, winning by just over 1,000 votes, which is awesome. That really solidifies, I think, the power of grassroots movements.
So obviously you and the Green Party have had some successes this past election. I know a lot has happened with respect to your portfolio already, and we'll get to that shortly. But can you speak to the overall reaction and tone within the Green Party to the election results and the increase in votership and with respect to working under the new cooperative government?
Yeah, totally. So I can give you, I guess, a bit of background without getting into very technical detail about the context in which we're operating under. So Aotearoa, New Zealand, Aotearoa is the Indigenous name of New Zealand, has been operating under a mixed member proportional, or MMP, kind of parliamentary and governmental system for just over the past 20 years. That was actually voted in by way of referendum, interestingly enough, and was campaigned upon by some of my forebears, the founding co-leaders of the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So that MMP, or mixed member proportional, effectively means that of the 120 members in Parliament, 50 of those are list MPs, and they get in by virtue of the proportional party vote, and 70 of those seats are for what are called electorate MPs. The Greens have not had an electorate MP for just over 21 years. Our first ever electorate MP was Jeanette Fitzsimons, the founding female co-leader of the party, who actually really, sadly passed earlier this year. And it was quite personally emotive, because Jeanette was one of those wonderful matriarchs and stalwarts of the party and of kind of activism, who took me under her wing when I first joined the party. Sometimes in left-wing movements you can be met with an element of suspicion. It definitely wasn't the case with her. She greeted all young people who came into advocacy with an immense amount of enthusiasm and wisdom. So it is a real kind of salient moment, I think, on the year that we lost Jeanette, to have won Auckland Central, our second ever and only electorate. So yeah, that meant quite a lot. But we also, in MMP history, have completely defied the usual trajectory of so-called smaller parties. So typically, what you've seen over the past 2 decades is that parties such as the Māori Party, such as the ACT Party, have gone into coalition or cooperation or confidence and supply with a larger party like Labour or like National. And subsequent to that, have, after their first term, fallen below what's called the 5% threshold, sometimes falling entirely out of Parliament, other times relying on an electorate seat to retain a foothold inside of Parliament and retain a seat there. The Greens completely bucked that trend. After our first term in Parliament in this term of government between 2017 to 2020, we had 8 members of Parliament, and just with this election gone, have increased that to now 10 members of Parliament. So we are not only the first kind of MMP party to have gone into and come out of and now forming government again, to have stayed above the 5% threshold, but also the only that has increased their vote. So you have to say that from that moment, there is kind of a sense of jubilation. But on top of that, probably quite worth noting that alongside the centre-left Labour Party, which as of the special votes being confirmed has themselves confirmed a kind of majority above and beyond what's necessary to form a government, at least 61 seats. They now have, I believe, 63. We have gone into a cooperation agreement, which I believe we'll get to later. But that vote, typically the Greens and the Labour vote are somewhat kind of tied to each other, in that as one goes up, the other goes down. But what you saw in this election is that both went up. So I think, again, that speaks to some kind of fascinating zeitgeisty thing that's going on with people realising a potential for change as communities, and particularly in the context of COVID-19, more of a focus on, or awareness of, how we're all only as strong as our most vulnerable.
You have drawn attention to the fact that the legislature in New Zealand is overwhelmingly of a certain age demographic. Since then, as a member of parliament and as a young person in politics, have you sensed a change in the attitude in the institution or among voters?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, and I think you're probably referring to a moment in Parliament last year, which became a bit of a meme, or actually already was. My little brother had been showing me TikTok the weekend beforehand, which is how I came across the statement, which then, you know, kind of got a life of its own. I think I popped up on Fox News as responsible for creating intergenerational warfare. So I think it's, again, important to contextualize how this happens, because sometimes things end up whittled down into sound bites which people then project onto. But basically, at that point in time, at the moment that that occurred, I was in Parliament speaking on the Zero Carbon Bill, now Act, which was a piece of law drafted by Green Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw, our male co-leader, who basically set a pathway to carbon neutrality in Aotearoa by the year 2050. I was speaking as a member of the Environment Select Committee, so as somebody who had sat through thousands of submissions from the general public, from school strikers and from, you know, those who work in agriculture, farmers, through to big business people, through to parents who were really concerned about the future that their kids were going to be inheriting. It was also coming just after one of the really big school strikes, where tens of thousands of young people took to the streets in one of the largest marches that we'd seen in this country since the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement protests. So all of these things were kind of in the back of my mind, and I also had just met with some school strikers who were on the forecourt of Parliament, who were speaking about how deeply important it was that their voices were heard and were felt inside of Parliament. And this was also coinciding with the fact that there is a burgeoning campaign to lower the voting age here, the so-called Make It 16 campaign. So all of these things were occurring, and I was speaking in Parliament about how all of these younger people were taken to the streets because they do not have a formal, for lack of a better term, method of engaging in our democracy. And it also felt really quite frustrating that all of these actions had taken place out in the real world, yet in the kind of ivory tower, there wasn't any meaningful recognition of these mass citizen movements. So speaking to how these were spearheaded by younger people in particular who didn't have a voice inside of our democracy at present. And how, you know, the average age of our parliament is around 50 years old, and, you know, you obviously can't use super broad brush strokes, but typically that speaks to how your time horizon of thinking about decisions and the kind of tail end of them isn't necessarily as long as those younger people who right now are worried about what's going to happen in their 80s, which is, you know, 60, 70 years down the track, versus those in parliament where it's only about 30 odd years. And I was talking about all of these things and about how I, you know, was the youngest in Parliament, but how bonkers that was, given that, you know, there's only 2 people in Parliament under the age of 30. And by the way, I am still, even though we've just gone through another election and I'm now 26 years old, I'm still the youngest one in Parliament, which speaks to the kind of direction of travel still needing to, you know, continue. But I was then heckled by the spokesperson from the opposition on climate change about my age, to which I responded. That then became this massive kind of meme and flashpoint, which garnered very peculiarly international attention, as well as kicking off a debate around intergenerational warfare here in Aotearoa. And I found that really interesting as somebody who has had to constantly justify their position inside of Parliament by virtue of my age. And I think anybody who has ever occupied the space of being pointed out as, or feeling implicitly as, a minority in any given space probably does. You have to, when you stick out like a sore thumb like that, prove yourself in a level and on a way that others who assume the space of the stereotype don't. And to the point of your question around, you know, do I feel now as though I've gained some greater semblance of legitimacy or validity or otherwise? It's a hard question to answer because no, not really. Not only am I young, not only am I a woman, not only am I queer, but I'm also a Green. And I think when you sit in a space in politics on what needs to be for those who are outside and who are struggling right now, kind of the cutting edge of the debate around policy and politics and trying to ground that in people's kind of experiences, it is so important to not, you know, rest on your privilege. So I think as soon as I started to feel comfortable, it'd probably be time for me to leave. So yeah, I'm not quite comfortable and don't plan on being anytime soon.
Now, a lot of people enter politics because they have a cause that is close to their heart. And as I understand, you've been a law student, journalist, radio host, and so much more. You ran for the mayor of Auckland at the age of 22, going back to the whole age factor, and prior to you becoming a member of parliament. What I would like to know is, was this your choice? Did you always want to be a politician? Or was there like a major turning point or other factors that kind of drew you to a career in politics?
Well, first things first, I don't see this as a career, and I think that as soon as somebody begins to envision it as a career, that's when you begin to become quite tied to your personal survival in this space. And I think that, you know, to use again a very broad brushstroke binary, is that inside of Parliament on a daily basis, you're kind of making a decision of which one of the two sides of a seesaw or a scale you're wanting to emphasize or place weight on. One of those is change and the other is your career. And effectively, if you place emphasis on self-preservation, then you are, of course, giving up some of that potential for change. Whereas if you are opting to stick your neck out and fight for change, then to a certain extent that can be career limiting. So for me, always, I have seen my role as in the space of change. But, you know, like I am a very working class kid. Like I'm one of the first in 3 generations, first woman in my family to not have had a baby by 20, first person in my family to go to university. I was never, like, politics and parliament were just completely outside the realm of anything that was ever considered. Like, I'm a high school dropout who has tattoos that swears too much. Like, I'm not the kind of person who was born and bred, let alone supposed to be anywhere near the institutions of power. But that's kind of the point, right? I feel very privileged to be now in this position where I've never had to pretend to be anything other than I am, because that means that I don't have a facade to maintain. And in turn, alongside, I think, kind of in tandem with the point around youth, is that when I first ran in 2016 for the Auckland mayoralty, which was more than anything kind of a protest, and I was asked about that by journalists at the time who were like, oh, you know, this is just a protest, surely. And they use that terminology in a way that, you know, through definitely the way that they articulated it, but as though it was synonymous with a joke candidacy. And, you know, I had this moment where I was just like, I don't think protest is a joke. I think that protest is like one of the most legitimate, like, time-honored means to try and bring about a flashpoint for change, conversation, and cultural shift. And that was also when I first came to realize the interconnections between social, or structural rather, and cultural change. Culture, by definition, from a design thinking perspective, is about a shared set of values. And And that's really interesting, right? Because we think about culture as though it's synonymous with someone's religion or ethnicity or geographical background. But from a design thinking perspective, it's about values, which is why you are able to have societies that are incredibly diverse but still inclusive. Although, you know, we have a long way to go in a lot of different societies around the world, but it's a shared set of values. So when you think about culture in that way, you are able to start thinking about culture and cultural touch points like education, media, protest, petition, community building, collective action as a way to facilitate awareness, which is effectively the glue or producing an environment that is conducive to structural change. And structure is, you know, supposedly the bread and butter of politicians, but it's things like legislation, regulation, funding, taxation, incentives, subsidies, contracts, procurement, even treaties, international treaties, and domestic, particularly amongst the Indigenous peoples here in Aotearoa, which has not been honoured properly. But nonetheless, those two things and that space for cultural engagement, you know, and being a journalist and working in small business and being a community organizer is where I've spent the most of my time, you know, my very limited thus far adult life. And that's where I feel like I have immense privilege in coming into a role like this, falling down that rabbit hole through protest, is because I have a perspective that isn't just focused on how, you know, of course I want to change laws, of course I want to change the taxation system, but I realize that the way that you do that is by building consensus. The way you do that is by distributing and particularly redistributing power to communities. So yeah, that's effectively some ramble on the question.
Going along that route, unfortunately, it seems that in this time in the world, people of all ages and nations find themselves facing some sort of disillusionment, you know, having to question democracy. As a young person and a green politician, as you mentioned, I imagine you must be familiar with going against the current. What advice do you have for young people that want to become leaders or get involved in politics? How do they face this as a challenge?
First things first, find your people. No one ever does anything meaningful alone, and I think that it's a very dangerous trap to fall into, the idea of kind of rampant individualism. You know, if we're focused on systemic change, which is the only way that we change anything on a mass scale, then we need to stop putting people on pedestals and we need to start organizing collectively. So what I mean by saying, you know, nobody ever does anything meaningful alone is we have a tendency, particularly like when you're at school and you're reading social studies books or whatever, to pinpoint people and movements of civil rights or gay rights or women's suffrage or whatever else and go, that was the person who did the thing, because they gave real sick speeches or they led marches or whatever. But actually what you find is that if there wasn't, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are also part of that movement, then they would have been mad people like speaking to themselves in empty halls or just walking down the street alone. It is in fact recognition of the skills and the experiences that everybody has to bring to a mass movement, and the fact that you're never going to get to that tipping point for change unless you are able to bring people along. So my advice to particularly younger people starts with, we talk a lot about this notion of inspiration. And we often use inspiration as a rationale to put somebody on a pedestal. But that is a really problematic way to look at inspiration. Inspiration is a mirror. Inspiration is about looking at somebody or looking at a movement or looking at a piece of art and seeing something reflected back to you that you admire about yourself. And that should be an invitation to get involved. So if you don't know where to start and everything seems massive and overwhelming, realize that there's kind of like this onion, right? There's like the things that you have direct control over. Then there's the things outside of that you have influence over. And then there's the things outside of that you don't. So COVID-19, for example, is something that you do not have control over. Where you were born is something that you do not have control over. But things like where you move, how you interact with the world, those are things that you have some semblance of control over or influence over. And obviously resources and otherwise can help to dictate that too. So my key advice is, firstly, realize that you don't know everything, but also nobody knows everything. Any politician, any leader who stands in front of you and tells you that they know everything is either lying to you or completely lacking self-awareness. I'm not sure which is worse. What that means as well is that you have heaps to learn, and so do others. And the only way that you get to any semblance of shared values, of understanding of the world around you, is by way of that communication. The other thing is that you can't take on everybody all by yourself, but also not every battle is yours to fight. So I have a lot of younger people asking me how, you know, you can engage with racists or with homophobic or transphobic people or whatever the case may be. First things first, do not expect the communities who are at the brunt of receiving that kind of stigmatizing or oppressive language or behavior to be on the forefront of having to deal with those people, because there's a lot of emotional labor that's required to have those conversations. But I also hold the very perhaps earnest and some would say naive belief that everybody is capable of every single value set. So if you are one of those people who occupy a certain position of privilege or aren't necessarily going to be impacted by you know, the outcomes of this vitriol that somebody's spewing, then you have a responsibility to engage with that person and to help breaking down all of those things. Best way to do that actually came out of some of the research that came out of universities, particularly in the States and the UK, after the 2016 election of Trump and Brexit in the UK. And therein we found that most people have never had to articulate verbally why they think the way that they do, which is partially why we have such partisan societies at present. Because you can walk into a circle of progressives and say the word Trump and everyone's like, oh yeah, because that is a term that's laden with a lot of things. You can walk into a circle of, you know, MAGA hat wearing people and say Trump and everyone's like, oh yeah, because the term means something entirely different in there. You know, so to ask somebody, you know, why do you think that way, and to genuinely listen to them in response, realizing again that you only enter that conversation if you have the time and energy to expend, you will slowly begin to sow seeds of change. And that is how we change the world, is in individual conversations with people that you're able to coordinate on a mass scale through organization. Nobody is able to do that all by themselves.
Lastly, turning towards the current affairs, you are the Green Party's spokesperson on drug legalization, namely the legalization of cannabis. As recently as last Friday, the day you were confirmed as an MP, the special votes cast in the cannabis referendum came back with 50.7% voting against legalization, which is such a close call, but effectively meaning that cannabis will remain illegal in New Zealand. What is your reaction to the results and the reaction of those you have been working with and representing? Is this it for the Yes campaign, or are there ways you plan to move forward with respect to decriminalizing cannabis under the new government?
Yeah, so again, for some greater context on that, what is really gutting about that result is to give people an understanding of how small the population in this country is. If 34,000 people had switched their vote from the no camp to the yes camp, the legalization and control of cannabis would have won. That is how slim this margin actually was. So it is frustrating primarily because I was kind of left out on a limb as the only kind of progressive, and the Greens were left out on a limb as the only progressive or left-wing or actually any politicians who are willing to argue the importance of drug harm reduction from the basis of control of supply chains and particularly removal of prosecution from our most marginalised communities for use and possession of cannabis. There are a lot of lessons that will come out in the wash after this campaign. But one of them, which I was abundantly aware of during, was just how partisan this became. So you had National, which is our conservative or, you know, right-leaning, although I would say that pretty much the most of New Zealand politics can fit almost entirely inside of the DNC. You know, they definitely, you know, I think, did a massive disservice to the public dialogue by creating a false sense of complete consensus inside of their caucus, saying that, you know, all of their MPs and all of their candidates were in favour of continued prohibition, which I know for a fact, speaking to their MPs behind the scenes, is completely untrue. But, you know, so it goes. Effectively, what ends up being reported in the media ends up being taken as, you know, reality. And then you have, you know, the Labour Party, including the most popular Prime Minister of a generation, kind of refusing to take a position on it, despite me having worked for 2.5 years behind the scenes with them on the production of this legislation. So yeah, I ended up being the only kind of political voice, and there also was, I think, a bit of a vacuum in terms of grassroots organising, particularly in the context of COVID-19 and the inability to do things like door knocking safely and contract tracing and otherwise. But in terms of what happens next, the key thing for me is to realise, as I was alluding to before, in the cultural space, we have moved the dialogue on drug law reform ahead by light years. Even those who came to advocate for prohibition couldn't advocate for retention of the status quo. So even they shifted their argument to a space of decriminalisation, which meant that we won some ground on that. My focus now becomes zooming out from just the issue of cannabis, because that was never my sole focus. I've been really focused over the past 3 years on things like reducing harm of methamphetamine, which is, you know, a huge plight in particularly regional New Zealand. Also on festival drug checking services, which, you know, I'm working with our former Minister of Police to get across the line, hopefully before the summer festival season. We have inverted seasons for the Northern Hemisphere, so it's summer, about to be summer for our Christmas. And also around making medicinal cannabis more affordable and ending the kind of criminalisation of so-called green fairies, which are, you know, people who produce medicinal cannabis effectively for their community but risk going to jail in order to do so. So you have 2 Labour Party ministers who commissioned reports in the last term of government, which both said the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975, which was a very Richard Nixon influenced piece of legislation, need to be completely repealed and replaced. So our focus continues to be, as the Greens, on repealing and replacing those archaic pieces of legislation, which absolutely are demonstrably unfit for purpose. And, you know, we, as I said back in 2018, when my medicinal cannabis members bill was voted down because the National Party and New Zealand First, who is now out of Parliament, decided to vote as blocks on that against, you know, we may have lost that battle, but we will ultimately win the war. And, you know, we will ultimately win this war, because the direction of travel is, you know, as I think MLK used to say, you know, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And more people are coming on board with this, because we've opened a can of worms and conversation and cultural change that is not going to be able to, you know, you can't put that genie back in the bottle.
Thank you so much again, Ms. Swarbrick, for your time. I'm sure many will be motivated to action, seeing you in your position now and what you have to say.
No, of course, thank you. And yeah, join your union, join your local collective action, just get involved. And, you know, if you don't like your politicians, just find someone in your community who you do like and you do trust, and support them in running. Electoral politics is not the be all and end all, but in the vacuum of nothing else happening, do it. Do something. Don't sit on the sidelines and throw stones and criticize those who are putting their blood, sweat, and tears into change.
Thank you again for joining me.
Ka pai. Thanks so much. I gotta run, but see you later.